nothing can compare. Come, let us adore Him.
Welcome to lesson number 3 in our study of the book of Daniel. In this lesson, we'll be looking at chapter 3, which is the familiar story of the fiery furnace. The date of this event is uncertain, but it definitely occurred sometime after Nebuchadnezzar's dream of chapter 2. The narrative presupposes the appointment of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the administrative posts that were reported in chapter 2 and verse 49. And the image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream very likely provided the inspiration for the one he builds in chapter 3. Daniel is conspicuously absent in this story. The stage is set for the story in verses 1 through 7. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the councils, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. The nature of this image is not clear. The text does not say precisely what the image looked like or what it was supposed to represent. It may have represented the Babylonian state, or it may have been intended to represent Nebuchadnezzar himself, or it may have been an image of Bel, the chief Babylonian deity. And of course, it's possible that all of these entities were intended to be represented by the great image. The lines of distinction between the person of the ruler and the power of the state and the glory of the gods were often quite blurred in many pagan cultures. And so bowing down and worshiping an image such as this would constitute an acknowledgement of the supremacy of all three of these entities over the life of the worshiper. To the heathen mindset, no religious oppression or persecution would be intended or noticed in Nebuchadnezzar's command. No prohibition against the practice of the individual's own cultural religion was decreed or implied. All that was required was the acknowledgement that the king of Babylon was superior to all other kings and that the gods of Babylon were superior to all other gods. The decree was really more political than religious in nature. To syncretize or adapt the nature of one's religion to suit the demands of changing political, social, or cultural realities was a non-issue for most pagan peoples. Of all the nations and ethnic groups under the thumb of the Babylonian Empire, only the monotheistic Jews would have been conscientiously unable to comply with Nebuchadnezzar's decree. And no pagan king could reasonably be expected to comprehend such an exclusivist religion. So Nebuchadnezzar's own cultural predisposition would not allow him to interpret the refusal to worship his image as anything less than rebellion and sedition. When the dedication ceremony for the image was over, Some of the astrologers, or again Chaldeans, as the text says, the highest caste of wise men, denounced the three young Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we read in verses 8 to 12. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. The narrative here doesn't mention in so many words that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down to the golden image at the proper time. We get that information in the accusation made against them by the Chaldeans. Part of the charge against them was a true statement. They had refused to worship the golden image, and they were not worshippers of the gods of Babylon. The other part of the charge, however, was a conclusion deduced from the facts and was patently untrue. The three young men were not guilty of disloyalty or lack of proper respect for the king and the state. And these Chaldean accusers were probably motivated more by jealousy of the exalted positions of these three young Hebrew men rather than by any real concern for the glory and honor of the king. And although Nebuchadnezzar was at first furious about the supposed slight against his armor, he seems to have cooled off somewhat by the time the three young men actually appeared before him, as we read in verses 13 to 15. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring back Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Nebuchadnezzar's offer of a second chance to comply with the edict was a gesture of remarkable leniency for an ancient monarch. Perhaps it was in deference to Daniel, but he doesn't seem to have really wanted to punish these men. Surely they must have just misunderstood the directive. So he gave them a second opportunity to worship the golden image. In rehearsing the consequence for noncompliance, he asked them rhetorically, What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Nebuchadnezzar either had a very short memory, or he didn't consider that a God who was wise enough to divine and interpret the king's mysterious dreams was also powerful enough to deliver his faithful ones from the king's wrath. The resolute determination of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not to comply with the king's demand constitutes the first of three dramatic climaxes in this story. They were well aware of the futility of trying to explain their reasons for civil disobedience to a monarch who simply could not grasp the concept of a one and only God. They chose instead to make a bold confession of faith in the power of their God and to submit their lives entirely to his sovereign choice. We continue the reading in verses 16 to 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. These young men believed that their God was all-powerful and well able to deliver them from the fire and from the hand of the king. But even if he chose not to do so, they would in no wise serve the king's gods or bow down to the king's image. And the reply rekindled Nebuchadnezzar's fury. For one thing, he was probably not accustomed to his subjects calling him by name to his face. And for another, he was probably severely wounded in his ego to see these foreign captives completely unaffected by his threats. If he couldn't coerce obedience through fear and terror, what did he have left? So he ordered the sentence to be carried out immediately, as we read in verses 19 to 23. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. These men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. The fiery furnace, as it is popularly called, was probably a beehive-shaped oven or kiln, made of brick or metal with one opening in the side for loading fuel and objects to be baked, burned, or fired, and another in the top to vent the heat, smoke, and steam. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the furnace while the king positioned himself at a safe distance to watch them burn. They were cast in, fully clothed, and the fine fabrics used for the clothing of high-ranking officials were highly flammable and would be excellent for maximizing the agony of the condemned men. Nebuchadnezzar chose the bravest soldiers in his army to throw them in. And the whole affair began to backfire from the start when Nebuchadnezzar's prize soldiers were killed themselves by the intense heat of the furnace. Well, as Nebuchadnezzar watched the pyrotechnics, he suddenly jumped to his feet in terror. In the second dramatic climax of the story, he saw something in the furnace which apparently none of his courtiers with him were able to see. Let's read verses 24 to 27. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's high officials gathered around and saw, in regard to these men, that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Instead of 3 bound men horribly burning to death, he saw 4 men, unbound, unhurt, walking around in the flames like they were on an afternoon stroll. And the 4th appeared to him like a son of the gods. Now, the King James rendering of this verse like the Son of God, is an inaccurate interpretation, not a true translation of the Aramaic text. Speaking again in his own terminology as a polytheist and a pagan, Nebuchadnezzar interpreted the mysterious fourth figure in the furnace as one who belonged to the same race of beings as the gods. Later in verse 28, after having had the opportunity to discuss the miracle with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he describes the fourth figure in the terminology of Jewish monotheism as an angel. Approaching the side opening of the furnace as closely as possible without being killed himself, Nebuchadnezzar called out to the three men, telling them to come out of the furnace. He called them servants of the Most High God. In so doing, he confessed their God to be the greatest among many. He was not yet able to understand that the God of Israel was the one and only God, but he had just answered his own question. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? He has also completely discredited the symbolism of his great golden image. And so we come to the conclusion of the story in verses 28 to 30. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. The time lapse between Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great image and the incident of the fiery furnace is not certain. It would appear, however, that the impression that the former event had made on Nebuchadnezzar concerning the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had faded away in the interval. Now it has been renewed, only this time even more emphatically. Nebuchadnezzar could not yet be described as converted, for he still perceived God as one among many. Nevertheless, he could not help but praise the God who could command such loyalty from his servants that they would boldly defy the word of the ruler of the world and submit their bodies to the flames for him. He also extolled the God who had the power to actually intervene in the course of natural events to rescue and save his faithful ones. There is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. So in the third and final dramatic climax of the story, Nebuchadnezzar guaranteed the official legitimacy and sanctioned the worship of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego within his domain. Anyone who spoke evil against this God would suffer the same penalty which he'd threatened the wise men if they could not divine and interpret his dream in chapter 2. They would be torn limb from limb and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap. Why? Because no other God can save in this way. That is an astonishing confession from such a devout pagan as Nebuchadnezzar. And in an ironic epilogue, the scheme of the Chaldeans, who originally leveled the charges of sedition against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, totally backfired on them when Nebuchadnezzar promoted the three Jewish youths to positions of even higher honor and responsibility in the province than they had had before. In the matter of the great golden image and the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar's education in the nature of the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego reached the next level. He'd already been impressed with the unlimited wisdom of God in the interpretation of his mysterious dream. Now he had learned of the unlimited power of God. And yet he still had so much to learn. In our next lesson, we will learn how God humbled the mighty King Nebuchadnezzar in an absolutely remarkable way to teach him the matchless glory of God.
You will reign.